We're sorry. You have reached a number that has been disconnected or is no longer in service. If you feel you have reached this recording in error, please check the number and try your call again.
This week on Disaffected. Yes, Virginia, some people really are bad. We show how benefit of the doubt from good-hearted people is blinding us to the predators taking over our culture. Then, grab your notebook for a demonstration of some of the common types of liars on the internet, how they do it, and how to sniff them out. Finally, we'll look at some of the most common shut-up moves used by people who don't want their cover blown. Learn how to push back against the morally deranged and their wig men who want you to believe that you are the villain. All of this and more this week on Disaffected. Welcome to Disaffected. I'm Joshua Slocum. This is the show where we talk about current events through the lens of abuse dynamics and personality disorders, and specifically cluster B personality disorders. It's the thesis of this show that the kinds of abuse dynamics and the sort of pathological personalities that most of us are familiar with, well, not most of us, but many of us are familiar with in terms of domestic abuse and child abuse they've gone feral. Right? It's not just in the home anymore. The abusive dynamic and the use of narcissism and emotional manipulation has really exploded in society. And although there is no one partisan type of person that can have a personality disorder or be under the sway of a cult-like collection of people with personality disorders, it happens to be that the political left, and especially the woke left today, is the primary example of this problem. So I'm excited to tell you that we have a special show coming up next week. Carrie Smith of the podcast Unsafe Space will be joining us. Carrie and I are going to talk about cluster B personality disorders in the family. She is with a podcast called Unsafe Space. It's a show with Carter Laren and Carrie Smith. It's become one of my new favorites. I highly suggest you check it out. They talk about a lot of the same things we do, but obviously with a different spin. And Carrie's had an interesting journey, in a way like I have, away from being a social justice warrior into having more complicated politics that don't reflect the priorities of the woke left. So be sure to join us next week. And I also want to plug alternative platforms. Our numbers are rising. Thank you to everybody who is watching us and people who are subscribed to us. But please remember, YouTube is a very censorious platform right now, and it is not likely that this show is going to have a long run on YouTube. At some point, they are going to censor us. Expect that. One day you will log in there and you will not see our show anymore. That's the way things are going. If you want to keep up with us, and I'd like you to keep up with us, if I could persuade you to please subscribe, even if you don't visit it every day, please subscribe on at least one alternative platform. Rumble is a great one. We're on Rumble. We're also, for audio, we're on Spotify. We're on Pandora. We're on iTunes. And of course, there's YouTube. But please, if I could persuade you to subscribe on Rumble, that would be great, because there's much less of a chance that they're going to can us because they don't like our political point of view. And of course, we now have Patreon too. Patreon.com/disaffected. That's spelled DISAFFECTED. And if you like what we do there, we sure would appreciate some financial support. Thanks, guys. So, there's all sorts of stuff happening in the news, and I'm not going to rehash all of it. You can get up-to-date analysis of the news on many podcasts, but there are a few things that I want to hit on. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, is one of them, and I don't want to say a lot about him because I'm tired of listening to people talk about him, and that includes me. But I do want to say that I find it interesting that the calls for Andrew Cuomo's ouster or impeachment never seemed to come until he had a series of Me Too moments, right? Hashtag Me Too. This is a man who made a decision to send elderly people infected with COVID-19 back to nursing homes by the thousands, which appears to have caused thousands of untimely deaths. that didn't need to happen because of that decision that he made. And yet that wasn't enough to move people. And it really disturbs me that it's enough to move people that he said something inappropriate or something even lewd to a woman in the office, or he touched her the wrong way. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not justifying sexual harassment. I shouldn't have to say this, and for some of you I probably don't, but because there's somebody out there who's going to take a clip from this, let me say it again. I am not minimizing sexual harassment. But what I am saying is, yeah, I do think the deaths of thousands of elderly people unnecessarily is maybe a little more important. If we have to rank them, if we can't do everything at once, I think that one ought to have moved people to look at Andrew Cuomo's position a little bit more. It really bothers me that certain topics that don't seem to index to the actual severity of harm in society are almost guaranteed to get somebody canceled when things that lead up to death are not enough. And I think the other thing that I'm going to touch on really, really quickly is that Meghan Markle interview with Oprah Winfrey. And you'll see as we get into the show, I'm going to tell you about the theme in a second. This isn't something that we should have to spend a lot of time analyzing, okay? A woman who marries into the British royal family and then complains about her privacy and complains about it by sitting down with one of the most famous and richest women on the face of the earth, Oprah Winfrey, is probably not somebody who's being entirely honest about her motivations. I only saw a few clips from that. I was not going to sit through 2 hours of that ridiculous tear fest and Meghan sitting there simpering and batting her eyelashes. But I got to tell you, Harry looked like a spouse under coercive control from a manipulator or a narcissist. Shouldn't be that much of a stretch. And I don't know. I wasn't there. You don't know. You weren't there. I don't believe her claims of racist treatment from the royal family. I just don't believe it. Anymore, anybody who says racism, you have to actually show me the proof. I am going to provisionally assume that the claim is false or that it is not supported until I see the proof, because it has become a get-out-of-jail-free card for anyone who wants to get a little bit of attention at the expense of someone else. In order for us to believe that the royal family said racist things about the skin color of their child or the child who hasn't yet been born, we would have to believe, number one, that the British royal family were that sort of unreconstructed in their racial attitudes. Number two, we would have to believe that people generally read Meghan Markle as black, and they don't. And most people know that. Yes, I understand. She has a mother who's black. I understand that she is multiracial. But the fact is, she reads as a dark-skinned white woman. This is not something that would be floating around in conversation if she hadn't been pushing it. And we'd also have to believe that the British royal family is so unsophisticated and so unused to dealing with personalities in their ranks who might use certain things to make the royal family look bad, that they'd be foolish enough to say blatantly racist things and expect her not to say anything. I'm sorry, I don't buy it. And that's all I have to say about her. So the theme of today's show is excessive charity when it's not warranted, and naivete long after the time that people should be grown up enough not to be that naive. I'm going to talk about what my friend Nina calls Slocum's razor. I know that sounds a little egotistical. Sorry, it's my name and she coined it, and I like it. Slocum's razor is never attribute to a mistake that which is better explained by a cluster B personality disorder. So, Occam's razor, of course, the famous maxim that says, the simplest answer is the most likely to be correct. Slocum's razor is a little bit like that. It's not quite exactly the same, because in order to analyze a situation or make a good judgment about the veracity of a claim that somebody is making, whether or not you believe it's plausible, believe it's possibly true, or whether it's an egotistical act on their part. You do have to apply some discernment to it. So it's not as if I mean to say that you should expect that anything you see that you don't like or anything you have a question about means that somebody else's personality disorder. That's sort of the caricature that critics like to say about people like me. But we are living in a media world and a political world where obvious, plain as day, narcissistic, egotistical people are parading around claiming to be oppressed, claiming to be the victims of racism, claiming to be the victims of not sexism, misogyny, because every mistreatment of women has been elevated from mere sexism to misogyny, which of course is hatred of women. And that word hate and hatred, big currency right now on the social justice left. Anytime you disagree, you're spreading hate. It's emotional inflation. It's histrionic. And I'm getting frustrated. I can almost see my producer, Kevin, rolling his eyes. All right, I'm not getting frustrated. I've been frustrated. Now I'm going to tell you about it. I'm frustrated with the number of people that I am seeing in public conversation and online who have been watching the same shenanigans that I've been watching for at least 5 or 6 years and still have a hard time putting their finger on what's going on. And this is where the excessive charity and the naive Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm outlook comes in. I'm going to give an example. I'm going to give a couple of examples. And I don't actually mean these to be a slam. It's very common, right? It's not common. There aren't that many people who take the approach that I do. The more there are, the better, as far as I'm concerned, because that's what I'm trying to get across to everybody here. I want to teach you to be able to discern these things and to make these kinds of more reasonable judgments so that you can separate friend and foe. But a lot of people seem to have a hard time accepting that not everybody who walks this planet is fundamentally decent. They approach the world and they approach tense situations with the idea that there must be a charitable explanation for every insult, every emotional tirade, every tantrum, every cancellation campaign waged against somebody. Well, why would someone do that? I just can't understand. Part of the naivete, it's not just excessive charity. There is excessive charity. Some people bend over backwards until you can hear their spine cracking to make excuses for somebody that any one of us can see is just a schoolyard bully with a blue check on Twitter. And I see a lot of this among academics, and some of it in the circle of academics that you would think of as being part of what they call the intellectual dark web, or the IDW. And these are people I like. These are people whose shows I listen to. These are people I respect. So I'm going to criticize some of the approaches that they take, but I'm not a hater. Okay? I don't hate them. I don't think they're stupid. But I think they need to be brought up short a little bit. Because I think that this faux naivete, not faux naivete, that's not fair. This emotional clinging to a naive outlook is really a problem. And it's not just blinding these individual people to the problems that they're seeing and the solutions to the problems they could come to. It's not just blinding them. It's actually harming our collective effort to push back against wokeism, because it is giving excuse after excuse after excuse. And most people tend to want to be charitable. I don't, as you could probably guess. A lot of people think I'm a cynic. Naturally, I disagree. I think that my cynicism is closer to a realistic outlook. But of course I would say that. But I would say of you, of course you would say that I'm a cynic and that I'm too trigger. I have too much of a trigger finger on seeing Cluster B. I understand that. I think you're wrong. And my hope is to persuade you to reconsider that throughout the course of this show. But I am seeing people say, why would they do that? Oh, what kind of stupidity does it take to actually believe XYZ? Very common. Somebody will say, trans women are women, and trans women are female, and they are biologically female because everyone has a biological body, and since trans women are women, that means they're female, and because they have a biological body, they are biologically females. If you don't believe that this is common parlance, just go online. That's not rare. That's common. This is the kind of diluted nonsense that comes out of the gender cult. And people who have their own podcasts that are much more well-known than me continue to agonize on the air. How could you be so stupid? What kind of miseducation would cause a person to believe that, they ponder? Stop it. Stop it. This isn't miseducation. It's not stupidity. They're not developmentally delayed. They are lying. They are not candid people. They're not fair dealers. They are lying. And I thought about this when I was listening to another podcast I'm going to recommend to you. If you don't read the British publication Spiked, you should. Their website is spiked-online.com. Spiked, I don't know what they would prefer to be called. In America, you might take their outlook, their political outlook is closer to what we call libertarian. I think they might say that they're a collection of people from the left and the right and the center, but a lot of people who adhere to the ideals of classic liberalism, which basically means they believe in individual sovereignty. They believe in solving public problems through a debate process that gets to the truth. They believe in government taking as light a hand as possible in interfering with other people's lives. And they believe in everyone being legally and socially given the opportunity to excel at those things they're good at. So that's sort of classical liberalism. But Spiked is phenomenal. They're one of the only outlets that consistently criticizes cancel culture and what's going on in the academy, in the universities with student unions, both in the U.S. and the U.K. And they have a number of podcasts, and one of them is by a comedian named Andrew Doyle. And I really like his show. I think it's just called The Andrew Doyle Show. So, Andrew, if you happen to watch this or listen to this, and I kind of hope you do, I'm using you as an example, but it's I'm not trying to sting you, right? I'm not trying to get you. Your point of view is common, but it's a good illustration. So I was listening to his latest episode today, and he's speaking to American cultural commentator Thomas Chatterton Williams. Did I get it right? I hope that's right. Thomas Chatterton Williams. Well, if it's not, I'll do housekeeping next week. And they were talking about what is going on in this fevered atmosphere where any deviation from the approved woke left line gets people calling your employer to get you fired, gets people saying that you're a transphobe or a misogynist online, or you're an unreconstructed racist. And it's not an exact quote, but Andrew said something like, I've really been wrestling with this. I've really been saying, it's hard for me. How are we going to persuade these people to come back to sanity? Well, you're not going to persuade them. And this is important. You can't reason unreasonable people back into reason, okay? You can't talk them logically back into sanity because the thought system that has captured them is not a sane, rational, coherent, or logical train of thought. It is a cult line of thought. They're not foolish. Well, they're foolish. They're not stupid. They're not delayed. They're not necessarily ill-educated. Many of them have advanced college degrees, which, of course, we're seeing are not really worth the paper they're printed on. But this is not a question of not being a sophisticated, cosmopolitan, or educated person. When it comes to things like the transgender ideology, the critical race theory ideology that proposes that all of our institutions and all of our social interactions have white supremacy lurking underneath, built into it, that you can't avoid that. At the center of these movements are grifters. They are people who are making a name for themselves, and some are making a great deal of money by positioning themselves as wise analysts of this situation who can prescribe a medicine for our social ailments. These people who are the leaders, I think they're cluster Bs. I think they're narcissists. I think that they're incredibly histrionic. I think some of them are straight up psychopaths. Yes, I am saying that I think some of them are psychopaths with literally no conscience and no empathy at all. Of course, the vast majority of people in these movements are not personality disordered, but they are vulnerable to personality disordered people who are charismatic and self-confident. And once you get wrapped up in this cult, it's very hard to see outside of it, because the cult teaches you that your worth as a person and your worth as an intellect or as a social actor is directly measured by how frequently you chant the slogans. Trans women are women. End structural racism. Defund the police. You have to say these things over and over again in order to be seen as a good person. So they tie up your sense of morality and your sense of your own conscience with compliance to their rules. This is not a rational conversation. It's an abusive conversation. You are never going to reason these people out of it. These people who are at the center. You have to push back. Stop extending so much charity to these people. And honestly, stop scratching your head. Stop saying, why do they do this? This is not difficult. We're going to talk about this in the next two segments too. I'm going to give you some very concrete examples. This isn't hard stuff, folks. It only seems hard because it's emotionally difficult to accept the truth. And the truth is, these are not good people. These are not... Do you remember when I talked a few episodes ago about one of the problems that many mental health professionals have who are not well trained in trauma and personality pathology? One of their problems is they treat every client who comes to them as if that client had a normal range personality. And a normal range personality is exactly what it sounds like. Somebody who has flaws, somebody who has really good character traits, but is generally in the realm of stable. It doesn't mean that they can't fly off the handle. It doesn't mean that they can't be an asshole. We can all do these things, but they don't have a personality disorder, right? They're not fundamentally narcissistic. They're not wildly and floridly unstable the way people with borderline personality disorder are. And as a result, when cluster B type people go into therapy, therapy often makes it worse. And what I mean by that is, take psychopaths, for example, and there's a lot of literature about this. You can read up on it. Some psychopaths, and particularly those in the prison system that are mandated to enter therapy as part of their ostensible rehabilitation for release into the outer world, therapy doesn't treat their personality disorder because half the time, or more than half the time, the therapist doesn't even realize that they're dealing with a distorted personality. What it does is it teaches them the language, it teaches them the lingo, it teaches them the conversational moves. It teaches them how to hone their manipulation skills and say the right things so that they can better fool the next therapist or the next judge or the next target of their con man scam. Okay? So this is the people, this is the character of the people that are behind these movements. And we need to wake up to that. So I'm going to close that out. That's the theme of this show. Come back for the next segment because I'm going to give you some concrete examples that you may have seen in the news, and one of them's really quite a bit of fun. So see us on the other side. Thanks so much for listening. Would you take just a minute right now and share our show on social media? On Disaffected, we take a close look every week at the abuse dynamics exploding in the dark and disordered world that we live in. Tell other people about us. Welcome back. A little bit of carryover from the first segment because it's going to help set up what we're going to talk about in this one. So in thinking about excessive charity and too much naivete and too much excuse making for toxic people, I have a couple of examples of how I have done this myself, and I want to share them with you because they're illustrative, but I want to get across to those of you listening and watching I do not think I'm better or smarter than you, okay? I believe that all of you can learn to do what I do, and that is why I do this show. I am not above you. I don't have, some particular special talent that you can't learn. What I know comes from experience and from a lot of study after I twigged to what cluster B personality disorders were. But it also came after doing every single thing I've criticized that I think people should stop doing, I have been guilty of, okay? So when you hear me say, please stop doing this, please understand it's a criticism, but it's not saying you're stupid or bad and you should have known, okay? Because I was that person too. We all go through this. But I have confidence that you can get more confident yourself. So if you haven't heard the first episode of this show, the origin story, and you're interested in a little more detail about my mother's derangement, the abuse that happened in our household, and how I finally understood at 41 years old what cluster B personality disorders were, go back and listen to episode 1, Mommy Issues. And the second episode is also a pretty good foundation. It's called Don't Diagnose. And it talks about the pushback that people get when they wake up to toxic people in cluster B and they start to see it all around them, as I have seen. You get a lot of pushback and you get people saying, oh, you're not a doctor, you're not a psychiatrist, you can't diagnose. And I deconstruct that and I try to show what that's really about and how it's really an elaborate form of shut up, I don't want to hear it. A couple anecdotes from my own days of excessive excuse making. In shorthand, my mother has borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. No, I have no idea whether she's ever been diagnosed. It's not the sort of thing that she would admit to, although she's been in therapy for many, many years fruitlessly. There are two of the cluster B disorders. So the 4 cluster Bs are borderline, narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial. And antisocial is a synonym for sociopath or psychopath. They mean the same thing. These are all grouped together under the B cluster in the American diagnostic system. They're called the erratic and dramatic personality disorders. And what they share in common, aside from being erratic and dramatic, is, in my view, a fundamental narcissism and a fundamentally compromised or absent conscience or sense of empathy. Even though there are borderlines who are absolutely not psychopaths, they don't have that limited emotional range. They're capable of experiencing much more emotion, and they often have at least some access to empathy. So it's not the case that they're all the same, but they are very similar, and they do share a fundamental narcissism, even though just one of those is called narcissistic. Narcissism is a trait that's found in all of them. And I spent most of my life making excuses for my mother. When I was a child, I did not have friends over to the house because I was embarrassed. I was afraid of what people would say about my family if they could see how my mother acted behind closed doors. And even when I got out into the world, I made excuses for her when close friends of mine, some of whom were far more effective parent figures to me than my mother ever was. I would not have had a college education, and I wouldn't have seen that there was a way to live a good life that was not mired in the white trash trailer park world that I grew up in, if not for these adults who took me under their wing and saw potential in me. So I got mothering from other people, and they could see my mother for who she was far, far before I could. I was 21 years old before I went to college. I dropped out of high school when I was 16. I had been institutionalized in a group home for incorrigible boys from 12 or 13 up to around 15 or 16. When I was 16 years old, I went to court and became an emancipated minor so that I wouldn't have to go back to my mother's house. And then I went and lived on my own. A very unstable, rocky time in my life. I was very unstable at that point. And it took me 5 years to get to get myself sorted out enough. And I'm glad that I did. I was not ready to go to college at 18. But I went to college at 21, and I'm the first person in my immediate family to have a 4-year education. I went to Sarah Lawrence College, which was a fabulous liberal arts education. I'm sorry to say, if I had children, I would not let them within 100 feet of that campus, nor any other liberal arts college or most universities, because they've been entirely taken over by wokeism. They're infested with cluster B ideology, and they don't even know it. But college graduation was a really big deal, as you can imagine, coming from the background that I came from. My mother didn't come. And my excuse for this, and it was an excuse that I believed myself, but it was also the excuse that I told to other people. My mother lived 3.5 hours away from the Sarah Lawrence campus. It's not like she couldn't have gotten there. She usually had junkie cars, but among my friends, somebody would have rented her a car. Somebody would have bought her a plane or a train ticket. There was no reason why she couldn't come. Well, I made the excuse, well, my mother has agoraphobia. She can't come. She doesn't like crowds. She gets really upset. Well, it's a selective agoraphobia, of course, because many years later, after my mother had managed to convince the family court system to give her custody of my niece, my sister's child, a girl she raised, who turned out to be an actual diagnosed borderline and sociopath. After she had been awarded custody of my niece, when my niece was 4 years old, my mother left the house, left my niece behind, left her husband behind, got on a plane to London to shack up with a poet she had met on Facebook, a drunk, a lowlife, just the kind of person that a borderline woman like my mother always picks up. She abandoned, essentially, her child. She abandoned her at 4 years old. She abandoned her husband, and she abandoned the rest of the family, and we were left to pick up the pieces. And you can see how that turned out with the psychiatric diagnosis that now describes my niece. So she didn't come to my college graduation, and then 10 years later, when I was 36 years old, I had a heart attack. November 10th, 2010. Luckily, I got to the hospital. I got an ambulance within about 20 minutes of the onset of symptoms, and within 40 minutes after that, they had put me into the cardiac operating room and put a stent in my heart and opened up the blockage. I'm forever grateful. And I have had no heart trouble since then. Health problems, yes, it's something I'll always have to monitor, but you don't expect to have a heart attack at 36 years old. And as I was being wheeled into the operating room, no, it was before that. When I was still in the emergency room and they were reading my EKG, it was a very frightening experience. As soon as the EKG came out of the machine and the nurse looked at the paper, everybody started running. And she came over to me and she said, "Who's your family?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Your family needs to be here right now." And she picked the phone up and she put it in front of me and she said, "Call your mother." So I called my mother as I was having a heart attack. And she was, she seemed to be upset, but it's very hard for me to know what she really felt, if anything. She started to cry, but my mother cried at everything. And of course any parent would. And at the time she said, "This can't be happening. I'm not ready to let you go yet." And at the time, the emotional effect that statement had on me put me right back in the parentified role with my mother. As I've said before, ever since I was barely older than a toddler, I had been my mother's emotional caretaker, her confidant, and kind of her surrogate husband. And I was immediately back in take care of mommy mode. And Then she started to wail, and she said, I don't know how I'm going to get there. My car won't make it. I don't know what to do. And I said, oh, Mom, don't worry. My friend Lisa is coming. Somebody will buy you a plane ticket. I have money. Or somebody will come, whatever. It does. I just don't know. I could never pay it back. I just don't know what to do. And it was only in hindsight that I understood what was going on here. My mother was making excuses not to have to get out of her house and come to be at the bedside while I was at death's door. There was no guarantee that I was going to live. I found out afterwards that it wasn't the worst kind of heart attack I could have had, but I had a 13% chance of dying within that half hour. My mother didn't care. She didn't care. My mother didn't care if I lived or died. And I couldn't accept that at the time. And so I made excuses. And, I told her it was okay, that I had friends, they would come, that I had somebody to stay with, but I was used to being by myself. It was fine. Everything was fine. So I've played this game. And this brings me into a couple of examples that I sort of titled on my notes here, examples of people that you should have known were obvious liars. And that's you, listener and viewer, or you on Twitter, seeing the same stories that I'm seeing. These are examples of the kind of manipulative, amoral people who lie and create false identities, and they have people eating out of their hands, particularly the woke left, and particularly women. These people are very, very good at exploiting the protective and nurturing instinct of women, particularly liberal women. They co-opt women into being mommies for them, and they co-opt them into their army of flying monkeys. The first one here is about the concept of intersex. And intersex is a variety of conditions that a person can be born with that in some way, they're also called disorders of sexual development. So they could be things like having chromosomal abnormalities that in a male that gives that male some female typical hormonal environment that causes problems. It could be all the way up to severe cases with ambiguous genitalia or genitalia that are deformed, or that seem to have some characteristics of one sex and the other sex. Basically, it's what everybody used to call hermaphrodite. And what you need to understand about that is there's no such thing as a hermaphrodite the way you think. Nobody is born with a penis and testicles and a vagina and a womb. That doesn't happen. That's a myth. It's like a cryptid. It's like Bigfoot. Never existed, doesn't exist now. But the trans activists have co-opted the intersex people to use as a crutch to legitimize themselves. So they like to mix it up so that if you have sympathy for someone who's born with something like androgen insensitivity syndrome, or Klinefelter syndrome, there's so many of them out there. This is how they legitimize themselves. They claim that they are intersex, or that they're like intersex people, that this isn't an emotional malady. They're not mentally ill. There's something wrong with their chromosomes. This is an actual biological, real phenomenon. And 98% of them you see online, it's nonsense. Here's a great example. Just saw this come across my Twitter screen the other day. It's from an article published in the International Journal of Sexual Health in 2012, but it's been getting play again lately, and I thought it was a good example. And the title of the article is Pretense of a Paradox: Factitious Intersex Conditions on the Internet. Delicious. Factitious, when you hear that, hear Munchausen syndrome. That's what you know as Munchausen's syndrome. The idea that you have something wrong with you biologically, or you have a sickness that you don't actually have. And some people who exhibit factitious disorder appear to believe at least some of their own claims, but many of them are just pathological liars. So it should be no surprise to anybody who goes on Twitter and sees, this is almost exclusively men who do this, trans women. Oh, I'm intersex. Let me read you the abstract from the paper. False claims of having an intersex condition taking the form of factitious disorder, Munchausen's, have occurred historically but are even more frequently observed in the era of the internet. 3 cases are presented that had previously been reported as genuine in print media, television programs, and online postings. Probable motivations include emotional nurturance, self-aggrandizement, denial of being transgendered, I'm going to come to that, and fascination with being intersex. Persons with factitious intersex conditions may interfere with peer group support and spread misinformation. While acknowledging the reality of intersex conditions in some people, we advise a high index of suspicion and, as needed, verification of claims. See? I'm not making it up, folks. The one niggle I have here, why people would claim to be intersex when they're not, denial of being transgendered, that's nonsense. There's no such thing as being transgendered. There are people who believe that they're born in the wrong body, but it's not actually real. It is a mental illness. It's a delusion. Doesn't mean they're not suffering. Doesn't mean they don't need help. They do. Doesn't mean they're bad people, but it's not real. And it disturbs me that the authors just take that at face value, like there were an established objective condition called being transgendered. So this paper gives 3 examples of factitious or Munchausen syndrome taking the form of claiming to have an intersex condition. And this is going to sound familiar to some of you who've been in the trans ideology wars online. They noted that these 3 examples, that none of the people they studied had plausible claims. This would have passed nobody's smell test who actually had any medical expertise, but it was widely believed by the media and by people on the internet, and I see this happen every day. So if you believe, and you might have a friend, I had a friend like this one time, a so-called trans woman. I didn't even understand this 15 years ago. He claimed he was intersex. He wasn't intersex. He was a man who'd had a sex change surgery. None of these people had plausible claims, and they noted that, this was a case of Munchausen syndrome. So here's an example. One subject reported herself to be in the process of a change to female sex at age 20. The same information was repeated on a newly created web page that included a photo of her as a blonde, femininely attractive young woman. You should know, although they're respecting the pronouns, they're talking about males here, not she and her. Roughly a year later, she contacted the Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome support group from a different country. She now claimed a contradictory history of complete androgen insensitivity syndrome with normal female genitalia at birth, a female sex of rearing. Sorry for the clunky language. They mean that this person claimed he was raised as if he was a girl. And no history of surgery. The content of her webpage, emails, and posts online to discussion groups followed the pattern of pseudologica fantastica, pathological lying generally seen in Munchausen syndrome. She told of inheriting a fortune so large that her career as a student at an Ivy League medical school was merely a pastime, of flying in a private jet airplane, and of living with not one but 2 beautiful women, one a gymnast, the other an international fashion model, in a lesbian menage a trois. Remember I talked about autogynephilia and fantasy? Bing bong. At one point, she was reportedly near the edge of death in the intensive care unit due to acute shellfish toxin poisoning. But postings from her email address to a discussion group continued with the same frequency and writing style, though ostensibly sent by one of the significant others to keep her online friends updated. After several years, Ms. Z largely disappeared from the internet. Surprise, surprise, surprise. That's one example of bullshit that anybody should be able to see as bullshit. So now you know, and now you're not going to believe these nonsense intersex claims. Do you see why I talk about cluster B so much? This is all cluster B. Factitious disorder or Munchausen syndrome is not a standalone condition. There's no such thing as a person who is a normal range, stable personality with no indications of mental illness, except she just happens to have Munchausen syndrome. That comes from borderline and narcissistic personality disorder. And in terms of being able to detect these liars, really good short thread on Twitter from a psychologist that I want to share with you. His name is Jonathan Shedler. He's a very good follow on Twitter. And he's one of the mental health professionals. I don't know if he would describe himself this way, but I would describe him as old school. He seems to have a really well-grounded theoretical framework that has not been influenced by the modern-day woke psychology light curriculum that seems to be happening in schools that train therapists. Let me go through that list of tweets for you, because it's directly relevant to what we're talking about. And think back to a couple episodes ago where I talked about the wounded bird camouflage, the cluster B, the narcissistic type people who paint themselves as victims, so that they have a cultural halo around their head and they're impervious to criticism, and you let them get away with exploitative behaviors because you believe they're good. So Jonathan says this: one of the most important things I've learned: severe personality problems find camouflage. No one thinks, I'm a sadist, or I'm a malignant narcissist. They find a belief system or a social group that validates their most hateful, destructive impulses and construes them as virtues. The most toxic and hateful people in the world are 100% convinced they fight for what is true and right. They find a way to give free rein to their cruelty, to attack, to treat others cruelly and viciously. And they find allies to cheer them on, who also believe that they are on the side of all that is true and good. For colleagues looking for a more theoretical explanation, the psychological processes are splitting, projection, and projective identification. Splitting means not recognizing one's own capacity for hate, cruelty, and destructiveness. The person is blind to the bad in themselves. Instead, they project the badness onto some designated other, and this other person, via the defense of projection, is now seen as the repository of all that is bad and evil and necessary to destroy. That's the projection. The person now feels fully justified in unleashing their viciousness and hate on the other person, who is now seen as someone monstrous who must be destroyed at all costs. If the person who is projected on attempts to protect or defend themselves, this is now seen as further confirmation of how hateful and evil they are. This is what is called projective identification. The end result is that the person can deny their own sadism, cruelty, and hate while simultaneously acting it out without restraint, and feel themselves to be 100% on the side of truth and right as they do it. This is exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about the sacred caste status that has been placed on people that the woke left likes as their pet examples of the oppressed. Trans people, particularly so-called trans women, men. Anybody who claims that they've been the victim of racism or racist microaggressions. Anyone that white liberals like to call a person of color. All of these sacred identities. This is, this is what happens. This is what making a particular identity into a sacred identity walls that person off from being a full human. It not only allows narcissistic people to exploit that, but it's also condescending. Because it's almost, you know what it is? It's the anthropological concept of the noble savage, right? The old idea that before civilization, humanity existed in a state of nature. It's a romantic notion. I think it comes out of the Romantics originally. And that it's just the white man and technology and industrialization that unleashed evil on the world. It's sort of like a modern day reworking of the Genesis story. You know, we were all living in the Garden of Eden until the Industrial Revolution and Christopher Columbus before that. it's not true. And once you put up no barriers to having this identity, meaning anybody who declares that they're a different sex is that sex, anyone who says they're trans, well, if she says she's trans, then she's a woman. When there are no boundaries, no gatekeeping, and no barriers, you are opening the door to predators, and they're doing it. That is what I'm talking about. And I know that many of you see this. When you wall people off from criticism, you're no longer allowed to call out cheaters when you see them. And look where we are. Example number 2 of big liars on the internet who should have been obvious. Oh, I love this one. And this gets me particularly because, as I've mentioned before, I work in the nonprofit sector. I direct a nonprofit organization, a consumer protection organization. And so I'm in the nonprofit world, and I have nonprofit colleagues, and I see this stuff going on. The nonprofit sector right now is a really scary place. It's been almost entirely taken over by woke ideology, critical race theory, transgender ideology. Not all, but most of the nonprofit organizations that I'm aware of are left-leaning, even though almost none of them are actually organized as partisan organizations, right? They're not, well, this is a Democrat nonprofit, this is a Republican nonprofit. The fact is that the helping professions, the human services part of the world, tends to be left-leaning, tends to be full of liberal people, tends to attract a lot of people who are very giving. They volunteer their time. They give their money to support it. I mean, these are the people that allow the work that my organization does to actually take place. There are, some really, really good people make the nonprofit sector work. But the nonprofit sector is extraordinarily vulnerable to cluster B takeover. I call this cluster B capture. This is like the concept of regulatory capture, like when a government agency that's supposed to protect the consumer actually gets captured and taken over by the industry it's supposed to regulate. This happens in all sorts of sectors. Cluster B capture is a big thing in the nonprofit world. And here's an example of it. This comes out of Canada. And this comes mainly from a long feature article in the Toronto Star that came out recently. And as you can see, here's our friend, the subject of this story, in one of her endless lawsuits. I'll talk about how she looks later. So from the Star. An Ottawa charity focused on the well-being of Black, Indigenous, and LGBTQ youth is in disarray after staff quit and speakers pulled out of a recent conference because they believe the group's leader has multiple aliases and a history of taking her enemies to court. Maxine Adwella, her real name is Althea Reyes, is known as the head of the National Collaboration for Youth Mental Health, which, according to its website, has spent nearly 20 years advocating for racially and culturally specific mental health services for young people. You noticing a pattern here with these people? Indigenous, race, LGBTQ, and always young people. Always young people. However, a recent court judgment concluded that a woman named Maxine Adwella is actually an alias used by Althea Reyes, a woman with a criminal past who was declared a vexatious litigant in 2017 for repeatedly launching civil proceedings to harass her foes, as the judge put it. A CBC News investigation of Reyes reveals a remarkable backstory that's led young staff and volunteers to walk away from the organization. Some allege that they have been subject to smear campaigns. So just as a couple of examples here of this woman's past, in 1990, she's a former beauty queen, by the way. File that away. In 1990, she was tried for fraud and forgery, but was acquitted. In 2011, Reyes drove over the foot of a woman who was trying to sue her. She was convicted of dangerous driving and failing to remain at the scene of an accident. What accident? Reyes also has convictions for fabricating evidence and theft under $5,000. And she also abandoned a dog and a ferret to starve to death. Again from the Star. Her list of lawsuits, this is the woman, the head of this charity now who's under investigation. She's the vexatious litigant. I think she filed more than 20 lawsuits. Her list of lawsuits is even longer. In 1990, Reyes launched, then withdrew, a $400,000 lawsuit against the Miss Black Ontario pageant and its director in a dispute over prizes she said she was owed for winning the contest, according to the Canadian press. In 2017, after launching approximately 20 civil proceedings that were, quote, designed to discomfort and harass her foes, end quote, Ontario Superior Court Justice Paul Perel declared Reyes a vexatious litigant, barring her from launching legal action without the approval of a judge. Now, I have a working list of tells. Things about a person that I add together. It's like an algorithm that I have in my head. The more things on this box they check off, the more likely I am to believe privately that they are probably a cluster B, a narcissist, a sociopath. These things by themselves are not diagnostic. They're not, but they correlate. And the more there are, and I'm sorry, but I'm usually right. Look at this woman. She's coming out of court, and I don't know, maybe it's me, but the carriage, it's not a mini dress, but it's a short dress with a slit. I mean, for all the world, she looks like she's declaring to the world, look at what a sexy bitch I am. And you see this a lot with these people. There are different kinds of narcissists, and there's some vernacular terminology. People talk about the somatic narcissist. That's a person who's usually narcissistically focused on their appearance and their sexuality. There's the cerebral narcissist. You often find this more in men. It's not about, how physically attractive they are. It's about how brilliant they are. But I have to tell you that, just looking at her, none of this surprises me. Again, appearances are not diagnostic. But there are tells in the way people present themselves that I suggest that you make a list mentally in your head and see how many they hit. And before we close this segment, I have one more recommendation for you. If you are interested in how cluster B personality disorders affect our legal system, there's a fabulous article called Disorder in the Courts. I can't give you a citation, but if you type in Disorder in the Courts, it's a legal journal article that was written recently that actually looks at who the cluster Bs are and what kinds of legal proceedings they file. I found it very informative. So come back and we'll round it out with segment 3. Thanks.
Hey listeners, guess what? We're on Patreon now. Bringing you this show costs money. Would you chip in to help? Go to patreon.com/disaffected. That's patreon.com/DISAFFECTED. Thank you.
Welcome back. I want to show you a couple examples as we close this show out of the kind of pushback that people like me get and that people like you are likely to get. Because my goal here on this show is I want to teach you what I know because it stood me in very good stead. And I want to show you some of the roadblocks, and I want to show you some of the ways that people will try to derail your pattern detection. And that's what this is. This is pattern detection. So the first example here, and these are examples from Twitter, and they're both pushback that I got over the past couple of days. I'm not going to try to load you down by all the context in the conversation, but I sound on Twitter exactly the way I sound on this show. So what I'm saying to you here, the kinds of things I say are exactly the same things I say on Twitter. With me, what you see is what you get. I'm blunt, I talk straight, and I don't hide my opinions. Yep, sometimes that's gotten me in trouble, but it's also protected me. And I want you to learn how to better protect yourself. So the first pushback is from somebody that I think of as a borderline personality apologist. I cannot recall. We're anonymizing this because I don't want to shame this person. It's not about that, but I do want to show this behavior. And I can't remember if this young woman actually described herself as a borderline. I think she did, but I may have been mixing her up with someone else. She certainly appears to have borderline traits to me. And here's one of those tells. I want to, and this is, I'll describe this after I do it. I'm going to pull a face here. As you have guessed, I like to pull faces. I'll describe it for you after I do it for those of you who are listening. This young woman's profile picture screams borderline to me. It looks like this. Wide open eyes, great big smile, manic, right? I know you've seen this expression. I know you have. Again, these things are not diagnostic in and of themselves, but they are a pattern that correlates. I'm not making it up. And if you start to notice these things, you'll see it too. Very frequently with certain types of borderlines and narcissists, or people who appear to be borderlines and narcissists, they have a stare. They stare at the camera with these wide open, manic eyes. They look slightly crazed, right? Big smile, and it's a fake smile, and the eyes and the mouth don't match. Very, very typical. It reminds me of a tell that you often see in psychopaths, and I'm not the only one who's noticed this. There's literature on this. You see somebody, and it's almost always a man. Sometimes it's a woman, but almost always a man. These guys, these violent guys that you see get arrested, at Antifa types and these so-called, anti-fascists who are really just anarchist agitators, they tattoo their faces. People who get facial tattoos, very, very common with male psychopaths. So here's the pushback. I was discussing how the woke left is chock full of cluster Bs in leadership roles and chock full of otherwise normal people. Well, we all have some damage, right? Otherwise normal people who've become flying monkeys. They carry out the dirty work for them, and they're true believers. They're enthralled to the cult ideology. This young woman really lost her shit with me. I'm not even going to show you all the tweets she sent me. So the first one, you're dangerously misinformed. And I talked back. I said, no, I'm not. What do you mean? She says, the point is that you're seeing your own problems or family history everywhere around you. It's actually a mental health phenomenon that happens. And if you're knowledgeable of borderline personality disorder, then you realize this is a hurdle to overcome, and it is often defended with victimization. Stop projecting. So you see, this is the reversal, right? They're very clever this way. They will pay attention to what you say so that they can turn it around and reflect it back to you and say it's indicative of your mental pathology. She says, I'm projecting. When I notice these patterns, I'm projecting. And I'm just, this is another version of you have mommy issues. You're seeing your own problems or family history everywhere around you. Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. And I'm seeing reality. I'm not making this up. I figured it out. And you can too. They don't like this. They do not like to be seen, and they do not like to be criticized. And they will try to pull on your heartstrings, and they will try to say that you're stigmatizing them, and you're making it harder for them to access treatment, and you're monstering them. Don't pay any attention to this. It's poison. It's poisonous bullshit. These people are manipulative, and to the degree that they actually do feel targeted, that's not your responsibility. Talking about the fact that borderline personality disorder is a pathology and a personality disorder is within bounds. They don't have to like it, and acknowledging reality because their reality affects all of us is perfectly reasonable. Don't let them shut you up with this. They're not soft little kittens. You wait until you don't do what they say, and that soft, mewling little kitten who says, please, please stop hurting me, will claw your goddamn eyes out. Then she goes on to say, Your projection of whatever mental health issues you face onto everyone else is obvious. Maybe talk to your therapist. Maybe talk to your therapist about how you're using victimization and unsubstantiated, irrational mental health finger pointing at the world to avoid your own problems. Just thought. Yeah. Sweetheart, you're talking about yourself. That's not me. I'm capable of projection. And as I've said in this show before, I've dealt with my own borderline and histrionic traits. They live in me. I'm not entirely outside this world. Most kids who come from a background like mine have something, whether you want to call it complex post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder. Most of us end up, yes, she's right, I do have mental health issues. I have far fewer of them, and they're far better integrated today than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But this is not an example of me having borderline personality disorder or projecting. I can see what's going on here. So this doesn't bother me. This used to cut me. When I first got awake to this, it really hurt me badly, and it made me feel very insecure. It doesn't now. I find it amusing, frustrating, but I want you to see it because that's what you're up against. And as I continued to try to talk to her, of course, she says, I'll delete everything now because you aren't hearing any of it and will distort whatever I say. That's also very typical. That's why I screenshotted. There's no need to distort what she said. It's there for the world to see. The next one bothers me a little bit more. Not personally. Again, I'm past the point where I feel insecure or I second guess myself. It's important to be self-critical, and it is important to listen to your critics. Just like anybody, I'm capable of going overboard, and particularly myself, I have an obsessive side to my personality. I'll gnaw on a bone until there's nothing left there. There are times when people have pushed back at me because I needed to be pushed back on. But these are not examples of that. I know the difference between when I've gone overboard and when people simply don't want to hear what I have to say for their own reasons, and that's what's happening here. This is from a professional. Again, we've anonymized him. But this is a psychologist who also describes himself on his Twitter profile as a forensic psychologist. And he follows me. Well, he did until I blocked him because I'm tired of his nonsense. But, he sees what I talk about on Twitter, I'm assuming, because he jumped in as soon as he saw me actually responding to that thread of Jonathan Shedler's. He actually pulled Jonathan Shedler and he tagged him in this. It was sort of like, I'm going to get the big boss boy to put you in your place. I don't know what Jonathan Shedler thinks of what I have to say because he didn't respond to this, but this was clearly an attempt to bring an authority figure in to put me in the naughty corner. And again, I was talking about wokeism being infested with cluster Bs and running on cluster B personality disorder rules. And this is what he had to say. This is don't diagnose, and it's coming from mental health professionals. And this is the kind of mental health professional that I think has made serious ethical missteps. If this is the way they talk to lay people, especially people who are, and I'm sorry to use this term, I don't mean it in a pitiful or self-aggrandizing way, but especially survivors of extreme and long-term narcissistic child abuse like me, to have mental health professionals try to gaslight us and tell us that we don't know what we're talking about is really quite bad behavior. So he says, he responded to one of my tweets, that's just prejudice in the guise of faux medicalization. Then he says, you don't know what you're talking about. What you said is made up, not an accurate description of any personality disorder. You use those terms to attack people, but you are using them incorrectly. People used to diagnose LGB people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, as disordered, but they were wrong too. Okay. You don't know what you're talking about. What you said is made up. No, it's not. No, it isn't. And I'm far from the only one who sees it, and I'm not the only one who says it. I don't know what I'm talking about? No, Dr. Sir. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a forensic psychologist. I don't claim to be, and I don't need to be. This is the point, folks. You do not need a psychology degree to detect personality pathology patterns in other people. Nor do you need their permission. They are not the gatekeepers. You don't have to ask Mr. Dr. Sir if you're allowed to speak about this. I don't know where these mental health professionals have gotten this idea that they have the right to police this conversation. Unless you're in my life rooting out the cluster Bs for me, get out of my face. Who do you think you are? Then he goes in for what he thinks is the real kill here. I'm a pro. You are just pretending and making things up. Wokeism is made up. Your comments are self-referential. You don't define woke. You just say that all woke are borderlines. If you deny you are borderline and woke, I'm sorry, I can't parse that end of that sentence. I'm a pro. You're a big boy, too. Good boy. You're just pretending and making things up. Wokeism is made up. I don't know what animates this man. I don't know what his personal pathologies may be, but he does appear to me to be completely under the spell and the bewitchment of the woke left, because I've watched his timeline, and this is a man who gets very emotionally overwrought about anything to do with Trump. He repeatedly tweets that Trump is a criminal and should be seen as seditious, that he incited the riot at the Capitol, which this man calls an insurrection. He falls for when I look at his tweets, he falls for every single histrionic emotional meltdown that the left has about Donald Trump. He doesn't believe woke is real. I think this says really an awful lot more about him than it says about me. It bothers me. It doesn't bother me personally, but it bothers me because people like him are intimidating to a lot of people. They will stop talking when they see that. They will believe, well, Dr. So-and-so said I don't know what I'm talking about, so I better not talk about mental health. I'm just a layperson. You know what? To hell with that. Psychology and psychiatry are disciplines that are barely more than 100 years old in a formalized way. Yet, we are still the same humans that we have been since the beginning of time. All sorts of personalities have always been with us and always will be with us. Cluster Bs aren't new. They've been around forever. I would say that many of the allegories, folk tales, especially things about the supernatural, the vampire, the witch, the banshee, the succubus, I think these are allegories for manipulative emotional vampires. I think they're allegories in some way of cluster Bs. We do not need these people's permission to talk about this. And frankly, if this is a guy who thinks that wokeism is just made up and that it's just a slur term that the alt-right uses to describe, the reasonable left, then, I'm not the one that needs to be on a psychiatrist's couch. And what this all comes down, this is turf guarding too. There are some, it's not most of them, but there are some mental health professionals who are frankly, they're very insecure. They like the recognition they get from the PhD after their name and the associations and the acronyms that go after their name. They seem to be more interested in being holier than thou than they are in sharing their expertise and translating it into something that the average person can make use out of in the everyday world. And that's what I want to do. I don't even want to be a professional. I don't want to be a therapist. That's not what I'm interested in. And this is what I'd like to convey to you. I know my worth. I know my intelligence, and I know the expertise that I have. I'm self-confident. I can see cluster B patterns very accurately. I'm not always right. And of course, there will be times when I think I'm right when I'm not, and I'll have to change my mind. But I'm very good at this. I do know what I'm talking about. I have up-close, personal, intimate experience with this. It isn't just my mother. My first boyfriend was a psychopath. We'll talk about him sometime. I, for many years, was a magnet for borderlines and histrionics in terms of my friendship circle. I have seen this over and over again, and I've been burned by it over and over again. And the things that I have put together in my mental toolkit of detection, lo and behold, are the same sorts of things that experts list in books that teach you how to recognize this stuff. So I know that I'm not making it up. And what I want you to understand is that you can do this too. And I think you need to. Because, as I've said before, we are living in the era of the cluster B. It's not just that they're getting more attention, it's that there are more of them. The literature shows that. There's been a stark rise in cluster B personality disorder symptomatology in many, many surveys that have been conducted over the past 10, 15, 20 years. It is getting worse, and a lot of it comes down to parenting and our culture. These people are running things. When I talked to you was it the last episode or a couple episodes before, about that bill in New Hampshire that would prohibit critical race theory because it is itself racist. This stuff is getting into the public schools. It's all over the country. Institutional racism. Question your whiteness. School children are being taught this stuff. This is cult stuff. It's cluster B stuff. You can see these things. You can avoid them. You can do what I do. What I'm talking about here is not high-level stuff. This is not rocket science. This is not beyond your capability. It only seems that way because at the same time that our culture has ramped up the adulation and the praise of narcissism and emotional instability, at the very same time, we are getting messages, those of us who question this, that if we question it, we're bad people. We're basically in the position of the abused child with a personality disordered parent above us. And it's causing people to shrink into their shells. It's causing them to keep their heads down at meetings. It's causing them not to object when somebody goes on a smear campaign against somebody else. It's taking over nonprofit organizations and changing their fundamental mission. And you need to be able to see this. So what I'd like to leave you with is a couple of things. Stop giving excessive charity to people who have already shown you they don't deserve it. You are capable of pattern detection. And if you are a person who scratches her head and says, why do they do this over and over again? I am talking to you and I'm talking about you. You're not a bad person. You're not stupid. I don't think I'm better than you. But you are not living up to your potential. And it's not just that you yourself are going to be vulnerable to this manipulation, but when you do this, you are fostering an atmosphere that puts the rest of us in danger. You are making people like me who are telling the truth. Again, I'm not trying to be your savior here, but you're making it hard for people like me because you're helping people say, look at him, he's crazy. He just hates his mother. This is all nonsense. He's the pathological person. Stop participating in that. You are not only hurting yourself, you are hurting other people, and you can do better. And two, connect this to what you already know. Many of you listening or watching right now have these experiences. You had families like mine, or you've been married to abusive wives or abusive husbands. Here's a really easy way to do it. Take out the word cluster B. If you find that too intimidating, ask yourself, do I know the type of character that's involved when you see an abusive husband who gaslights his wife, hits her when nobody can look, puts bruises on her in places that no one will detect in public? Am I pretty good at seeing when there might be an abusive husband, when my girlfriend is in a relationship with a guy who's likely to abuse her? If you have that experience, you already know how to do what I do. You already know how to detect cluster B. You just need the framework. You need to understand that your knowledge is true and that it is not just abusive husbands. It's abusive mothers, it's abusive bosses, it's abusive politicians, and it's abusive social do-gooders. What this is pattern detection and predator detection. These are important life skills. The last thing I want to say is I want to recommend a book again to you called The Gift of Fear. It's by a man named Gavin de Becker. And it talks about this type of person, and it gives really illustrative anecdotes of people, some celebrities, some normal people that he's worked with who have been stalked, who have been the subject of years-long smear campaigns that cost them their jobs or their life savings. Gavin de Becker grew up in an incredibly abusive and violent household with deranged parents, and he knows what he's talking about. And what he calls the gift of fear, he's talking about your intuition, he's talking about your gut. And he shows you, his book was a revelation to me. He shows you how your gut is usually right. I believe intuition is a sense that we have. I don't believe there's anything metaphysical. I don't think it's supernatural. I think it's subconscious processing of information cues that come in from smell, from sight, from the way somebody carries themselves to the tone of their voice. You can't quite work it out mentally, but when you meet somebody and you instantly get your shoulders tighten up and your stomach contracts, your intuition is telling you something true. Listen to it. Thanks. I'll see you next week. When you subscribe, hit that notification bell and stay with us in real time as we take a new close look every week and examine how to identify and contend with the abuse dynamics at play in the world around us. Thanks so much for listening. Would you take just a minute right now and share our show on social media? On Disaffected, we take a close look every week at the abuse dynamics exploding in the dark and disordered world that we live in. Tell other people about us.